Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? It was one of those grey London mornings that had forgotten entirely what sunlight looked like. The sky was the colour of wet stone, the pavement slick with last night's drizzle, and even the milkman outside moved as though the fog weighed on his shoulders. Inside the modest but cheerful Beresford flat at South Audley Street, a small fire was doing its best to fight the gloom, snapping fitfully in the grate like a soldier refusing to retreat. Tuppence Beresford, wrapped in a rose-coloured dressing gown and fortified by her second cup of tea, sat at the breakfast table surrounded by a modest battlefield of envelopes. Bills, circulars, an invitation or two. The Morning Post was her preferred adventure, and she approached it with the precision of a general and the curiosity of a cat. Tommy, across from her, was hidden behind the Times, only the edge of his coffee cup visible above the fortress of newsprint. Every few minutes the rustle of the paper was accompanied by a faint, thoughtful grunt, the universal sound of a man pretending to read while his mind wandered elsewhere. "Two from the gas company," Tuppence announced, opening envelopes with the efficiency of an executioner. "One from Aunt Lucy, which means she's remembered our existence again, and—" She stopped, frowning at a cream envelope whose thick paper looked strangely out of place among the bills. It had no return address. The handwriting, firm and elegant, read simply, "Mr. Thomas Beresford, private and confidential." "Well now," Tuppence said brightly, "who's been writing you such mysterious letters, Tommy? Have you been consorting with duchesses again, or is it the taxman in disguise?" Tommy lowered his paper, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Probably another dull business thing, old girl. Someone wanting me to chair a committee on ex-service pensions or the like." He reached out casually, but when his eyes met the handwriting, something in his expression shifted, a small tightening around the jaw, a flicker of recognition quickly buried. He turned the letter over in his hands, then slipped it quietly into his pocket. "Not opening it?" she asked, her tone all innocence but her eyes sharp as ever. "Later," Tommy said shortly. "No sense spoiling breakfast with official nonsense." Tuppence arched an eyebrow. "That sounded almost convincing. Who's it from, darling? The government? A secret admirer? You've gone quite pale." He forced a chuckle. "Nonsense. The toast is burnt, that's all." But the conversation faltered after that. The clatter of the teapot and the ticking of the clock filled the room in uneasy counterpoint. When Tuppence rose to clear the plates, she noticed Tommy had already moved to the window, staring out into the misty street below as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. By lunchtime, Tommy's restlessness had developed into a full-fledged ailment. He'd taken to pacing the sitting room, checking his watch, and pretending to read the same paragraph of Punch 3 times over. Tuppence, curled comfortably in the armchair with her knitting, observed this with quiet amusement. "Tommy, if you walk one more circuit of that rug, you'll wear a path right to Scotland. Out with it. What's the matter?" He smiled a little too quickly. "Matter? Nothing at all. Just, I've remembered an old contact from my intelligence days. Fellow might need a bit of advice. Thought I'd pop over and see him this afternoon." "Intelligence days," she repeated. "You do make it sound like the Stone Age. Who is he?" "Name wouldn't mean much," he said lightly, slipping into his coat. "I shan't be long." "Then you won't need your overnight bag, will you?" she said sweetly. That earned her a startled glance before he recovered himself. "Just habit, dear girl. One never knows what the weather might do." "Or what trouble one might step into," she murmured as the door closed behind him. The flat seemed emptier without him. The afternoon stretched long and thin. The ticking clock seemed louder, the fire less cheerful. Tuppence tried to busy herself, a half-hearted attempt at darning, a desultory telephone chat with Mrs. Sprocket from next door, but her thoughts kept circling back to that letter and Tommy's strange face when he'd read it. By early evening, drizzle had turned to proper rain, drumming softly on the window panes. Tuppence stood by the hearth, frowning at the forgotten umbrella propped beside the door, Tommy's favourite, with the silver handle shaped like a fox's head. He never left without it, not even on a clear day. She bent to examine it. The handle was damp, as though he'd gripped it nervously that morning, and there was a faint scent clinging to the wood, something sharp and unfamiliar. Ink? No, more like old stationery, the smell of hotel paper. She turned the umbrella over idly and noticed a scrap of envelope paper still caught beneath the binding. It was almost too faint to read, but when she held it near the firelight, the watermark emerged in ghostly letters. The Kingfisher Hotel, Torquay. Torquay? She murmured. Since when has Tommy business in Devon? The question hung unanswered in the dim room. The only reply came from the clock chiming 7:30, marking the time when a wife begins to worry. The next morning arrived no brighter. The fog still pressed against the windows, and the fire had gone out during the night. Tuppence awoke to the silence of an empty flat and the cold realization that Tommy's side of the bed had not been slept in. She rang the local cab company. No record of Mr. Beresford hiring one. She telephoned Blunt's detective agency, their occasional consulting firm. No message there either. By midday she found herself pacing just as Tommy had, her mind darting between irritation and unease. He might at least have left a note, she said aloud. Even secret agents write to their wives occasionally. Then she saw it, a small square of paper tucked under the sugar bowl on the breakfast tray. His handwriting, brisk and familiar. Don't worry. Back soon. Tea. It was reassuring only in the way a bandage reassures when one doesn't know the depth of the wound. Tuppence stared at the note until the words blurred, then folded it neatly and slipped it into her dressing-gown pocket. Her eyes drifted again to the scrap from the umbrella, the Kingfisher Hotel. The name tickled a memory. They'd once stayed near there, years ago during one of their early adventures, when espionage and seaside holidays had the strangest way of intersecting. It had been a place of elegance and whispers, of guests who spoke in half-sentences and smiled too quickly. And now Tommy was there, under some forgotten pretext, chasing a ghost he hadn't told her about. By late afternoon she could bear the waiting no longer. She pulled on her travelling coat, tucked the scrap of paper into her handbag, and set out into the drizzle. The rain had slackened, leaving the city streets shining like pewter. A train to Torquay left from Paddington that evening. She knew because she had already looked. As she locked the front door behind her, she glanced once more at the silent flat, the empty teacups, the chair pushed back at an angle, the paper still folded at the same page as yesterday. For a moment, doubt flickered. Perhaps it truly was just an old contact. Perhaps she was chasing shadows. But then she remembered the look in Tommy's eyes when he'd seen that handwriting. Not fear exactly, but something close to guilt. And Tuppence Beresford, who could forgive a great many things, had never been able to resist a mystery. Outside, a cab splashed to a halt by the curb. She gave the driver her destination in a steady voice. As the car rolled away into the London fog, she pressed her gloved hands together and murmured half to herself, "Well, Tommy, whatever game you're playing, this time I'm playing too." The city fell behind her like a curtain, grey and secretive. Somewhere beyond the rain and rails the Kingfisher Hotel waited, and with it, the truth of the letter that never should have arrived. The Kingfisher Hotel stood above the sea like an aging dowager still pretending to be young, elegant in outline, but with weather stains creeping along its white facade and a certain weariness about the windows. The brass letters of its name were dull with salt, and the revolving doors sighed mournfully as Tuppence stepped inside. The lobby smelled faintly of lavender polish and seaside damp. A tall man in a frock coat stood behind the desk, consulting the guest register with the air of one who ruled a very small kingdom. "Good afternoon," Tuppence began cheerfully. "I wonder if you could assist me. My brother, Mr. Thomas Beresford, was staying here earlier this week. I'm afraid I may have missed him." The manager, whose badge declared him to be Mr. Haskins, blinked politely. "Beresford? I don't recall the name, madam." "Oh dear," Tuppence said, her tone all flustered innocence. "Perhaps he used his middle name. He sometimes signs as Barton, T. Barton." Something flickered in Haskins' expression. "Ah, yes, Mr. Barton. Arrived 3 nights ago, left the following evening rather suddenly." "Suddenly?" she echoed. He coughed delicately. "We are accustomed, of course, to discretion, but if I may say so, your, brother seemed somewhat agitated during his stay." "In what way?" "There was a visitor, a lady, pale, quiet sort. Wore a blue coat, I remember, because she left it behind when she departed in such haste." Haste? Tuppence repeated, leaning forward. She ran away. Haskins cleared his throat. I wouldn't go so far as to say ran, madam, but she left quite without notice. There was some kind of disagreement, I think. Voices were raised in the lounge that evening, though our walls are, he hesitated, not as thick as they once were. Tuppence gave him her most sympathetic smile. You poor man, how distressing. I do hope my brother didn't cause a scene. Not at all, said Haskins quickly. He left shortly thereafter, alone. She absorbed that in silence, her fingers idly turning the handle of her knitting bag. Did he leave a forwarding address? No, madam, only settled his account and took a cab toward the station. Toward it, she murmured. Not necessarily to it. Pardon? Nothing, she said lightly. Thank you, Mr. Haskins. You've been most helpful. Might I see the lady's coat? Perhaps I can arrange to return it to her. He hesitated, torn between policy and politeness. It's in our lost property room, madam. If you would care to wait, I'll fetch it. When he had gone, Tuppence moved quietly toward the guest ledger. The open page showed a neat list of names. Mr. T. Barton, room 12. Beneath it, in a faint, looping hand, was Miss Clara Dean, room 9. She noted it carefully. When Haskins returned with the blue coat draped over his arm, she gave it only the briefest glance. Soft wool, faintly scented with violet, and a small tear along one sleeve. Pretty, she said, smiling. She must have been quite upset to forget it. Indeed, said Haskins. She left behind a small parcel as well, but no address. I was considering sending it to the police if unclaimed. Tuppence's eyes lit with polite alarm. Oh dear, better let me handle that. I'm sure I can deliver it properly. My brother did mention something about assisting this lady. Poor thing, perhaps she was unwell. Haskins, reassured by her confident manner, nodded and handed over a brown paper parcel no larger than a book. If you're quite certain, madam. Quite, she said sweetly. And do put everything on Mr. Barton's account, won't you? She left before he could wonder if that made any sense. Outside, the sea wind slapped at her hat and tugged her scarf. The sky was streaked with pale silver clouds. The tide murmured against the rocks below. She found a bench facing the bay and unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a handkerchief embroidered with initials, C.D., and a torn corner of a photograph. The image was old, faded, showing 4 men in military dress beside a jeep. One of them was unmistakably Tommy. Scrawled on the back in the same feminine hand were 3 words, Lisbon, 1943. Remember? Tuppence's heart gave a small, cold lurch. Lisbon, the city of shadows, secrets, and wartime betrayals. Tommy had once spoken of it in tones that suggested there were chapters he preferred closed forever. Clara Dean, she murmured, running a finger over the initials. Or is it Clara something else? What on earth have you dragged him into? She watched the waves rolling beneath the pier, the gulls turning white against the clouds. Her mind was already working in its quick, methodical way, noting the clues, connecting the threads. Tommy travelling under an alias. A woman from his past, perhaps from wartime service. An argument. A vanished pair, and now a silence that stretched too long. No, she thought firmly. This was no coincidence. And if Tommy had set out to protect her by keeping secrets, he had only succeeded in provoking her curiosity to its full, formidable strength. She folded the photograph piece, tucked it into her handbag, and rose. The wind caught at her coat as she turned toward the railway lights glowing faintly along the cliffs. Kingfisher Hotel, Blue Coat, Lisbon, 1943, she said under her breath as if testing the rhythm of a code. Well, my dear Mr. Beresford, wherever your trail leads, you'll find I'm already on it. She glanced once more at the sea, now darkening under the weight of dusk, and smiled faintly. There was adventure in the air again, that same electric tingle she hadn't felt since their early days of espionage and puzzles and midnight escapes. Gathering her knitting bag, she began walking briskly toward the station, her heels clicking against the cobblestones like a declaration of intent. Behind her, the wind carried the faint clang of a buoy bell over the water, a lonely, rhythmic sound, as though the sea itself were marking time until she discovered what Tommy had tried so hard to hide. That evening, returning through the Kingfisher's quiet lobby, Tuppence paused at the desk. The guest ledger she'd seen the day before was open again, but the line that had once read Mr. T. Barton, room 12, was gone, neatly torn out. "Well, my dear Tommy," she murmured, "you've been clever, but not quite clever enough." After luncheon in the dining room, a quiet affair of sole meunière and watery lemonade, she began her inquiries with the staff. Tuppence had the gift of making people talk. She could look as harmless as a Sunday school teacher one moment, and as conspiratorial as a duchess with a secret the next. The chambermaid she cornered in the upstairs corridor was a shy young girl with a Devon lilt and eyes wide enough to betray every thought. "Excuse me, my dear," Tuppence began kindly, pausing by the linen trolley. "I wonder if you can help me. I'm trying to find a friend who stayed here last week. Mr. Barton, room 12. You might have seen him." The girl nodded immediately. "Oh, yes, ma'am. The tall gentleman with the kind eyes, and the lady who came to visit him. She was ever so pale. Wore a blue coat, she did." "Ah," said Tuppence, as if the detail were quite trivial. "And what was her name?" "Miss Dean, ma'am. Clara Dean. I remember because she gave me a shilling for bringing up her tea, and not many guests do that. She seemed troubled, though, sat by the window for hours, looking out to sea." Tuppence's tone was light, conversational. "Did she and Mr. Barton, my brother, you know, seem acquainted?" The maid hesitated. "I think so, ma'am. They spoke quiet-like, but I heard her say something about the code book and the Lisbon file. That's all, ma'am. They went out together later that evening, toward the cliffs." Tuppence's knitting bag shifted slightly in her grip. "And they both returned?" The maid's fingers twisted at her apron. "Only him, ma'am. The gentleman came back late, after midnight, looking white as a sheet. Miss Dean's room was empty come morning. Mr. Haskins said she'd left suddenly, but—" She trailed off, eyes downcast. "But—" The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "The police came asking questions the next day. Said a lady's handbag had been found near the cliffs." Tuppence smiled reassuringly, masking the quick stab of alarm that had run through her. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very helpful. I dare say you'll find another shilling in your pocket before the day's done." She left the girl with a coin and a kind word, then crossed the street to the promenade. The sea stretched before her in calm defiance of anything sinister, glittering under the afternoon sun. Couples strolled hand in hand, children flew kites, and somewhere down the pier a brass band was playing "A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square." Yet beneath the brightness, Tuppence felt the unmistakable pull of danger, quiet, elegant danger, the kind that dressed itself in charm. At the corner of the esplanade, a porter was leaning against a wall, smoking with the leisure of one who had nothing urgent to do. He was the talkative type. Tuppence recognized it immediately, and within 5 minutes she had him reminiscing about the hotel's more colourful guests. "Mr. Barton, you say?" he said, scratching his chin. "Aye, I remember him. Polite chap. Always tipped proper. Spent a lot of time looking over the cliffs with that lady in blue. Funny business, that. Went off walking one evening. Looked like they were arguing. Only one of 'em came back." "Arguing?" Tuppence echoed softly. "Aye. I was closing up the gate by the path, see, and I heard her say, 'You promised me the truth,' clear as anything. Then she walked off ahead, and he followed. That was the last I saw. Next morning the coppers were down there, all excitement." Tuppence's hand tightened on her bag. "And Mr. Barton?" "He checked out next day. Looked like he hadn't slept. Paid cash, no quibble, but he was white as paper. Left in a rush, too. Funny thing, though." "Yes?" "He dropped a photo when he got into the taxi. I picked it up to give back, but he'd gone. Thought maybe I'd hand it in, but the manager told me to forget it. Said the gentleman wouldn't want his private matters spread about." "Did you keep it?" Tuppence asked mildly. He hesitated. "Might have done. Thought it was too nice a picture to bin. Soldiers, I think. Somewhere hot. One of them looked a bit like that chap, only younger." Tuppence's eyes brightened. "Would you be terribly kind and let me see it?" He grinned sheepishly. "You've a way of asking, miss. That'd make a saint hand over his halo." From his pocket he drew a small torn corner of a photograph. She took it and compared it with the fragment she already carried from Haskins' parcel. The edges met perfectly, the tear closing like a healed wound. Together they showed 5 men beside a jeep, the inscription now complete, Unit D, Lisbon, 1943. "So, It's the same photograph, she murmured, and one more secret it wasn't ready to give up. Why must everything lead back there? The porter looked apologetic. Didn't mean to trouble you, miss. Thought it might be sentimental-like. You've no idea how sentimental, she said softly, tucking the photograph into her handbag. You've done me a great favour. As evening fell, she walked along the promenade, the sea darkening from blue to indigo. The lamps flickered on one by one, halos of yellow trembling in the mist. The scent of salt and fried fish mingled with the laughter of late strollers. And then, a movement. Across the beach huts below, among the deepening shadows, she caught sight of a figure, tall, familiar, walking quickly toward the jetty. The tilt of the shoulders, the gait. It was Tommy. It had to be. "Tommy!" she called before she could stop herself. The figure froze, turned slightly. Even at that distance, she thought she saw his face, or at least the outline of it. But then, as a cloud passed over the moon, he was gone. Tuppence ran down the path, her heels slipping on the damp stone steps. She reached the line of huts, empty, silent, their doors rattling in the wind. There was no sign of him, only the restless hiss of the sea and the faint cry of gulls overhead. "Tommy," she whispered, but only the waves answered. She stood there for a long moment, catching her breath, forcing her heart to steady. Perhaps it had been a trick of light, or wishful thinking, yet deep down she knew. Tommy was, or had been, here. Somewhere between that cliff path and the tide, a truth was waiting to be uncovered. She turned back toward the hotel, the night now fully fallen. The lamplight glimmered faintly on her face, revealing determination more than fear. In her mind, the pieces began to align. Clara Dean, the blue coat, Lisbon, 1943, Tommy's sudden secrecy. Each detail was a thread, and Tuppence, who had always been a master at untangling knots, was already beginning to weave them together. When she reached her room, she locked the door, set her knitting aside, and drew out the torn photograph once more. The sea wind brushed through the open window, scattering a few grains of sand across the sill. "Whatever you've done, Tommy," she said quietly, gazing at the faded image of her husband in uniform, "you needn't hide it from me. Not any more." She laid the fragment on the bedside table, beside her travel diary, and turned out the light. Outside, the sea whispered secrets to the cliffs, secrets of those who had come and those who had not returned. The sea had turned cold and grey overnight. Waves hurled themselves against the jagged Devon cliffs as though trying to erase some recent memory. The morning papers, fluttering damply in the hotel lounge, carried a headline that made Tuppence's pulse quicken. "Woman feared lost near Torquay Cliffs. Handbag found." She set the paper down carefully, as though it was something fragile that might shatter. A handbag. Not just a handbag. Miss Clara Dean's handbag. She knew it before anyone told her. By mid-morning, the little seaside town buzzed with curiosity. Fishermen stood in knots outside the harbour cafe, speculating between puffs of their pipes. "Walked too close to the edge," one said, or maybe took a dive herself. Another shook his head gravely. "The tide'll tell, always does." Tuppence tightened her scarf and strode toward the cliffs, the wind catching her coat like a sail. The police had cordoned off the area, but she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged. Inspector Renshaw, a square-built man with a weather-creased face, was issuing brisk orders to constables combing the beach below. He turned as she approached. "I'm afraid this area's restricted, madam." Tuppence offered a composed smile. "I'm quite aware. My name is Mrs. Beresford. My husband was acquainted with Miss Dean." That earned her a longer look. "Beresford, you say? There's been some talk of a gentleman by that name lodging at the Kingfisher. Mr. Barton, he called himself. You'll forgive me for saying so, but we don't care for aliases round here." "Nor do I," said Tuppence evenly. "May I ask what you found?" He hesitated, studying her face, the calm grey eyes, the unruffled poise. "You'd best hear it from me straight. We found a lady's handbag halfway down the slope. Blue leather, initials CD. Inside were a few personal items and a photograph torn clean across the middle. We also found a scarf near the edge, caught on a bush. Looks like she slipped." "Or was pushed," Tuppence said quietly. Renshaw's brows rose. "You think there's foul play?" "I think," said Tuppence, "that my husband walked with her that night, and that he came back alone. I'd very much like to know why." The inspector's tone cooled. "Are you suggesting your husband had something to do with this lady's disappearance?" "I'm suggesting," she replied crisply, "that Tommy Beresford never walks anywhere without a reason. If Miss Dean vanished, he either tried to stop her or someone tried to stop them both." Renshaw regarded her with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. "You've a lively imagination, Mrs. Beresford." "It's kept me alive more than once," she said. They walked along the cliff path together, the wind biting at their faces. Below them the surf foamed white against black rock. Renshaw pointed with his walking stick to a narrow shelf halfway down. "There's where the handbag was found. No footprints worth mentioning. Wind wiped them clean overnight. Locals say they heard shouting around 10 o'clock, but that's the kind of story folk like to tell once a tragedy's in the air." Tuppence crouched near the edge, examining the grass. Something glinted faintly among the pebbles. She plucked it out, a small brass button, dulled by salt spray. "Not much of a clue," Renshaw said, watching her. "Perhaps," she murmured, turning it in her palm. "But this isn't from a woman's garment. It's military. British issue. Possibly from an old greatcoat. My husband has one very like it." Renshaw's mouth tightened. "I see. Well, until we find a body, there's little more to be said. The tide sweeps hard along this coast. If she went over, she's gone." Tuppence straightened, her coat whipping around her. "You don't believe she's alive, then?" He gave a short laugh. "After a night in that sea? No, madam, I'm a realist." She looked out over the grey horizon. "So am I, Inspector. But I've also learned that the truth floats, sooner or later." Back at the Kingfisher Hotel, the air seemed thicker, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the whispers. Guests moved quietly through the hallways. A pianist played soft, uncertain tunes in the lounge. As Tuppence passed the front desk, Mr. Haskins looked up, eager and nervous. "Dreadful business, Mrs. Beresford. You heard about the accident, no doubt. Poor lady, so gentle, so recently in my husband's company," Tuppence finished dryly. "Yes, I've heard." He blinked. "Surely you don't think—" "I think, Mr. Haskins, that gossip is a most efficient thing. Let's not feed it more than necessary." She ascended the stairs to her room, her mind working swiftly. If Tommy had been here, if he had quarrelled with Clara Dean, it must have been about something weightier than sentiment. The wartime photograph, the code book mentioned by the maid, the words Lisbon, 1943. Something from those old days had resurfaced, something dangerous enough for Tommy to hide it from her. The corridor was silent as she reached her door. She noticed it immediately, the faintest sliver of light under the threshold, the smell of disturbed dust. Her hand tightened on the knob. Inside, chaos. Drawers yanked open, clothes tossed about like the aftermath of a storm. The suitcase lay overturned, stockings spilling out like white ribbons. On the dressing table, her compact lay cracked in two, and beside it, the place where she had left the torn photograph, was empty. In its place lay a single folded note. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold and slanted. "Go home, Mrs. Beresford. For your sake, and his." The words were neat, deliberate. No signature. Tuppence read them twice, then sat slowly on the edge of the bed. For a long moment, only the wind through the window broke the silence. Then she laughed softly, not with amusement, but with something colder. "So that's how it is," she murmured. "Someone thinks they can frighten me off. Poor fool." She rose, straightened the bed cover, and began to tidy the room with quiet efficiency. Every movement helped her think. Whoever had entered hadn't been a thief. No valuables were missing, only that photograph. The intruder had known exactly what to take. When she rang for the chambermaid, the girl appeared pale and nervous. "Oh, ma'am, what a mess. Did someone—" "Yes," said Tuppence calmly. "Someone did, and I don't believe it was room service." She watched the girl's reaction closely. The maid hesitated before speaking. "You weren't the only one, ma'am. Mr. Fenwick in room 7. His things were gone through too. He told Mr. Haskins it must have been boys from the village, but—" "But," the girl bit her lip. "He looked frightened, ma'am, like he'd seen a ghost." Tuppence thanked her, sent her away, and locked the door behind her once more. Then she took out her small notebook and began to write, her neat hand moving swiftly. 1. Miss Dean, missing. 2. Handbag and scarf found near cliffs. 3. Photograph stolen from my room. 4. Note, warning me to leave. 5. Inspector Renshaw, doubtful but not hostile. 6. Mr. Fenwick, possible link. She closed the notebook with a snap. The pattern was forming, faint but definite. Someone wanted the past. Tommy's past. Buried. But they'd made one mistake. They had underestimated Mrs. Beresford. That night, she stood once more by the window overlooking the sea. The lights of fishing boats flickered like tiny, uncertain stars on the black water. The wind carried the tang of salt and something else. Fear, perhaps. She thought of Tommy, somewhere out there, bound up in secrets she hadn't been meant to share. The note's warning echoed in her mind. For your sake and his. Her reflection in the glass met her gaze steadily. "If you think I'll turn back now," she whispered, "you've never met Tuppence Beresford." She pulled the curtains closed and switched off the lamp. In the dark, her resolve hardened like steel. Tomorrow she would find Inspector Renshaw again, question this Mr. Fenwick, and uncover the truth, no matter what waited beneath the cliffs or within her husband's silence. Outside, the wind howled across the rocks, carrying with it the faintest echo of a woman's voice, lost, pleading, gone. She didn't wait for the police to catch up. By dawn, she was on the first train back to London, the stolen photograph heavy in her handbag and one name fixed in her mind, Major Atherton. London greeted Tuppence with its usual grey indifference. The fog had rolled in thick from the Thames, smothering the lamps in a milky haze and turning every passing motor car into a phantom. But she had no time to admire the melancholy charm of the city. She was on a trail, and trails, especially the kind her husband left behind, didn't wait politely to be followed. Her cab turned down Pall Mall, where old clubs crouched behind stone facades like retired generals keeping secrets. The driver pulled up before a building with a brass plate reading the Imperium Club, members only. Tuppence gathered her gloves and her courage. If she had learned anything in her years beside Tommy, it was that a well-dressed woman with confidence could pass any guard in the Empire. Inside, the club smelled of cigars, leather, and old victories. A butler, sleek as a cat in mourning, looked askance at her. "I'm afraid ladies are not." "I'm not a lady," said Tuppence pleasantly. "I'm a visitor, and I've an appointment with Major Atherton." The name worked. Within minutes she was ushered into a private lounge, lined with portraits of men who looked as though they had never smiled in their lives. Major Atherton was the exception, or at least he tried to be. He rose to greet her, a tall man in his late 50s with a soldier's bearing and a politician's grin. His hair, silver at the temples, lent him the air of someone who had once been dashing and still rather believed he was. "Mrs. Beresford," he said, taking her hand. "Tommy's wife, of course. I wondered when you'd come." "You expected me?" "My dear lady, when old ghosts start walking, they rarely travel alone." He gestured to a chair beside the fire and poured 2 whiskies. The flames threw flickering light across his medals, which gleamed like old confessions. "I understand you were in Lisbon," Tuppence began. "Was and wasn't," Atherton replied with a smile. "One was everywhere in those days. Lisbon, Cairo, Algiers. The war was a movable feast, Mrs. Beresford, and we were all invited whether we wished to dine or not." "Clara Dean," she said quietly. "You knew her." The glass paused halfway to his lips. "Ah, so that's the name she's using now." Tuppence leaned forward. "Then you admit you knew her by another?" He sighed, setting down his drink. "Clara Durand, a courier for our side. Brave girl. Reckless, too. She carried messages across occupied territory when most men wouldn't have dared cross the street. Vanished in 45, shot, we thought. But apparently the dead don't always stay buried." "And she carried something?" Tuppence asked softly. "A code book." Atherton's eyes narrowed. "You've been busy?" "Yes. A cipher, one of the last we used in the Lisbon network. Only 3 of us knew the pattern, myself, Beresford, and Durand. Then it vanished, along with her. Without it, the records were incomplete, but rumour had it that cipher contained names, British names, people who'd been selling information to both sides." "Double agents?" He shrugged. "War does strange things to loyalty. Money does stranger things." Tuppence studied him over the rim of her glass. "And Tommy? What was his part in all this?" Atherton hesitated, then reached for a cigar. The smoke curled up slowly, making halos in the lamplight. He was part of the same operation. He and Duran worked closely, too closely, some said. When she disappeared, he took it badly. Always thought she'd been set up, wouldn't let the matter rest. Tuppence felt the words like tiny drops of cold water. Too closely. She kept her voice light. So, you think he's still chasing that cipher? After all these years? Perhaps, Atherton said quietly. Or perhaps it's chasing him. Some of those names were very important people, Mrs. Beresford. Powerful people. If that code book ever came to light, it could unmake reputations, undo governments. I'd say your husband's playing with fire. Tuppence's tone sharpened. And Clara Durand? Why reappear now under another name? What does she want? He gave a small, humorless chuckle. Maybe she wants the same thing as all of us who survived the war, peace of mind. Or maybe she wants revenge. He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the fog-dimmed lights of London. I'll tell you something, Mrs. Beresford. There's a rumour that the cipher wasn't lost at all, that it was hidden. Someone used it to buy safety after the war, that someone might have been Clara Durand, or your husband. When he turned back, his eyes were suddenly old and weary. Find him, Mrs. Beresford. Find him before someone else does. Tuppence left the club with more questions than answers. The fog had thickened. The street lamps looked like moons behind gauze. She walked briskly, her thoughts chasing themselves in circles. Clara Durand alive, a wartime cipher implicating British agents. Tommy entangled in it all. The pattern was widening, and somewhere she felt certain Clara's disappearance and Tommy's silence were threads of the same tapestry. At her small hotel near Victoria, she wrote a letter to Inspector Renshaw enclosing a copy of the warning note from her ransacked room. There is more to this than a missing woman, she wrote. Please treat this as confidential. She signed it and sealed the envelope with decisive firmness. The next morning dawned raw and colourless. A light rain pattered on the window ledge as Tuppence ordered breakfast in her room. The knock on the door came just as she poured her tea. A young constable stood there, hat in hand. Mrs. Beresford? Sorry to trouble you, ma'am. Are you acquainted with a Major Atherton? Her hand stilled on the teapot. Yes, I saw him only yesterday afternoon. Why? He looked uncomfortable. I'm afraid the Major was found dead early this morning, in his rooms at the Imperium Club. Tuppence's heart seemed to miss a beat. Dead? How? Natural causes, so far as we can tell. Heart failure. But the coroner's not satisfied. There was a glass of brandy by the bed, half drunk, and a bottle that doesn't seem to have come from the club's bar. They're making inquiries. Tuppence thanked him mechanically and closed the door. She sat very still for several minutes, the fog pressing thick against the windows. Then she rose, opened her handbag, and took out the small brass button she had found by the cliff. She turned it over slowly in her hand. British issue, like the ones on Tommy's old coat, and, she now remembered, on Major Atherton's. By midday, the newspapers were already whispering, ex-Major found dead in Pall Mall Club, no suspicious circumstances. But Tuppence knew better. She visited the coroner's office under the pretext of being a family friend. The clerk, a round man who liked to talk, was easily persuaded to part with details. Heart failure, they say, he confided. But there's the question of the discoloration around the lips. Bit too much for brandy, if you ask me. We're waiting on the chemist's report. And then there's the note. What note? She asked, her pulse quickening. He lowered his voice. Found on his desk, just one line. She wasn't supposed to die. No signature. Tuppence thanked him and left, her mind racing. She wasn't supposed to die. Clara Durand, or someone else entirely? And what of Tommy? Was he still protecting her memory, or covering for something darker? That evening she sat alone in her small sitting room, the lights dim, the city murmuring beyond the fogged glass. She placed Atherton's name beside Clara's on her notepad, drawing a thin line between them. Clara Durand, alive. Atherton, dead. Cipher, still missing. Tommy, silent. The logical mind of the detective in her husband's partner began to assert itself. If Atherton had been silenced, then the cipher must still exist, and whoever wanted it had no qualms about eliminating obstacles. She poured herself a brandy and stared into its amber depths. You were right, Tommy, she murmured. You shouldn't have gone alone. Her eyes fell on the Morning Post. Among the circulars and advertisements lay a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing only one sentence in precise block letters: "Stop asking questions about Lisbon." No signature, no mark, just that one warning, stark against the white paper. Tuppence folded it carefully, laid it beside the brass button, and smiled without mirth. "I suppose," she said softly, "that's as good as an invitation." Outside, a church bell tolled the hour. Somewhere across the city, in a world of shadow and silence, the game that had begun in Lisbon 20 years ago was stirring once more, and Tuppence Beresford was now part of it. 2 days later, Tuppence Beresford returned to Torquay. The sea was doing its best imitation of serenity, smooth as glass, pale as pewter, but hiding all manner of currents beneath. The promenade lamps flickered into life one by one, casting long, rippling trails across the water. To the casual eye, she might have been a widow seeking rest, wrapped in a neat black coat and veil, her luggage modest, her manner subdued. That, of course, was precisely the idea. Her reflection in the glass of the station waiting room was a small triumph of disguise, the perfect portrait of a woman who had known quiet sorrow, but not defeat. She had changed her name in the hotel register to Mrs. Trentham, a name she'd used once during their post-war investigations. Few remembered her as Tuppence Beresford. Fewer still would link her to the vanished Mr. Barton. When the cab drew up before the Kingfisher Hotel, she allowed herself a small, inward smile. The building looked no different, a faintly peeling grandeur, its white facade like a smile that had been powdered too often. Yet it felt altered, as though the walls themselves now whispered secrets. Inside, the same faint scent of polish and salt greeted her. Mr. Haskins, the hotel manager, received her with the automatic charm of a man who had practiced it for decades. "A single room, Mrs. Trentham. Sea view?" "Yes, please," she said in her softest voice. "My doctor advised sea air. I find it so very restorative." He nodded sympathetically, scribbled in the ledger, and handed her a key. Tuppence noticed with practised ease that the page already contained a familiar name: Fenwick, room 11, the same corridor where Tommy, or rather Mr. Barton, had stayed. Her mind clicked forward a notch. After supper, she took a quiet seat in the lounge. A handful of guests lingered by the fire, an elderly couple whispering over a crossword, a young honeymoon pair lost to the world, and a solitary man of about 60 reading a newspaper through gold-rimmed spectacles. He looked up once and smiled, a mild, kind smile, the sort that made people instinctively trust him. He had the neatness of a retired solicitor, the politeness of habit, and the faint melancholy of one who reads obituaries for sport. When the waiter came round with coffee, he addressed her in that careful tone men use when seeking company without offence. "Forgive me, madam, but one seldom sees a new face here at this time of year. May I?" "By all means," said Tuppence, folding her knitting. "It's pleasant to have someone to talk to. I'm Mrs. Trentham." He inclined his head. "Fenwick. Harold Fenwick. A dreary old name for a dull fellow, I'm afraid." "I doubt that," she said, smiling. "You look far too observant to be dull." He laughed quietly. "Observant, yes. My one failing. I watch too much and say too little. Comes of spending too many years in government offices." "Ah," she murmured. "A civil servant?" "Of sorts. Intelligence work, once upon a time. Very minor, I assure you." The words were dropped so lightly that they might have been nothing, but to Tuppence they rang like a bell. "You must find Torquay rather tame after all that," she said evenly. "Oh, not at all. I find the sea air bracing, the company civilized, and the staff discreet. Besides," his eyes twinkled, "one never quite leaves the old trade. Information always finds one in the end." Tuppence laughed politely, but her pulse quickened. "And do you still, as they say, keep your ear to the ground?" He leaned forward conspiratorially. "My dear lady, when one has lived through Lisbon in 43, one never quite stops listening." It was said so casually she nearly missed it, but she caught the phrase, every syllable sharp as a pin. Lisbon, again Lisbon. He stirred his coffee, apparently oblivious to her silence. The things that happened there could fill a dozen books. Lies sold by the pound, loyalties by the ounce. London knew only half of it, Lisbon knew more than London ever dared to print. The spoon clinked once against the cup, punctuating the sentence. Tuppence smiled faintly, masking the jolt that ran through her. "What an extraordinary remark, Mr. Fenwick. I can almost hear the typewriters." He shrugged modestly. "Merely history, Mrs. Trentham. I was a small piece on a large chessboard. One does what one's told and prays one is on the right side." She tilted her head. "And my late husband used to say the same." The faintest flicker crossed his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps recognition. "Ah, military." "Intelligence," she said softly. "He was in Lisbon too." For a heartbeat, silence. Then Fenwick smiled again, polite, but now with a trace of calculation. "A small world, isn't it?" Later, when she retired to her room, the fog that had been creeping up from the harbour pressed thick against the windows. The air smelled faintly of salt and damp wool. Tuppence sat at the writing desk, her mind working swiftly through the conversation. Mr. Fenwick had known Tommy's alias. Of that she was certain now. His glancing knowledge of Lisbon was no accident. She crossed to the dressing table and drew out the hotel ledger. The night clerk had been all too happy to oblige when she claimed she'd misplaced a friend's forwarding address. The inked names gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Mr. T. Barton, room 12. Mr. H. Fenwick, room 11. Same arrival date, same departure morning. Coincidence? Tuppence did not believe in those. She replaced the ledger, locked her door, and sat by the window to think. Below, the sea murmured against the breakwater. The foghorn sounded its low, mournful note. She was beginning to understand the game, though she didn't yet know the players. Fenwick had been close to Tommy, perhaps an ally once, perhaps something darker. And his cryptic remark, "Lisbon knew more than London ever dared to print," had the ring of someone who carried guilt or leverage. A floorboard creaked in the corridor. Tuppence froze. The hotel was quiet. Most guests were abed. She heard it again, a soft, deliberate sound. Someone moving just beyond her door. Her hand went automatically to the bedside drawer where she kept her small revolver, a relic from earlier adventures. The metal was cold against her palm. The handle turned slowly. She waited, breath held. Then, without a sound, the door eased open an inch. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the faint sigh of the sea and the slow rasp of the hinge. She rose silently and moved toward the light switch. The door widened another fraction. A shadow slipped inside, tall, hooded, silent as smoke. The figure crossed to the writing desk, gloved hand moving swiftly. Tuppence stepped forward. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said clearly. The intruder froze, half-turned. In the lamplight she saw only the gleam of eyes beneath the hood. Then, with a sudden movement, the figure flung something onto the desk and bolted. The door slammed. Footsteps pounded down the corridor and vanished into silence. Tuppence ran to the threshold, peering into the dim hall. Nothing. Only the faint sway of the curtains at the stairwell window. She locked the door again and turned back. On the writing desk lay a small brass object. She picked it up carefully between finger and thumb. A single shell casing, empty and smooth, engraved near the base with the letter T. It wasn't the caliber of Tommy's old service pistol, she noticed, but someone wanted her to think it was. Her breath caught. "T," she whispered, "for Tommy, or for threat." She placed it beneath the lamp, staring at it as though it might answer. Whoever had entered had known her room, her name, her purpose, and they had wanted her to know that they knew. She sat for a long while, the wind tugging faintly at the window, the waves below like restless whispers. The brass glinted softly in the lamplight, a warning, a promise, perhaps both. At last she slipped the casing into her handbag and murmured to the empty room, "Well, my dear, it appears the game's begun in earnest. And if you're out there somewhere, Tommy, you'd better hope I find you before they do." The next morning, Tuppence appeared at breakfast as serene as ever. Mr. Fenwick was already there reading the Times. He looked up as she entered and smiled, the very picture of genial innocence. "Ah, Mrs. Trentham, you look refreshed. Slept well, I trust?" "Perfectly," said Tuppence, taking her seat. "I find the sea air quite stimulating." "Indeed," he said, folding his paper. "Strange weather last night. Fog thick enough to hide anything, or anyone." Their eyes met briefly over the teacups. Neither smiled. Then, as he rose to leave, he said lightly, "Do take care on the cliffs, Mrs. Trentham. One can lose one's footing so easily." She watched him go, the echo of his footsteps fading into the corridor. Her spoon stirred the tea absently, though her thoughts were racing far ahead. The game was tightening around her. Fenwick's cryptic knowledge, the missing cipher, the shell casing marked with T. Somewhere within those letters and lies, her husband's truth was waiting to be found. And Tuppence Beresford, widow only in appearance, intended to uncover it. The sea had changed its mood again. What had been calm and silver the day before was now restless and dark, throwing white-tipped waves against the pier as though protesting some long-held secret. The gulls wheeled low, their cries thin and discontented. Tuppence stood on the promenade, the wind snatching at her scarf, her thoughts turning in circles as endless as the tide. The shell casing in her handbag felt heavier than brass. It was a question, waiting for an answer that refused to come. And then she saw him. At first it was just a silhouette at the far end of the pier, a tall man standing with his back to the sea, shoulders slightly hunched, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. She knew that stance as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. "Tommy." He turned slowly. For a moment she saw only the shock in his face, then a flicker of guilt, and finally the weary tenderness of a man who had run out of places to hide. "Tuppence." His voice was hoarse, roughened by lack of sleep and something deeper. She walked toward him, her heels striking the boards with deliberate steadiness. "You've got some nerve," she said, her tone calm and clipped, "leaving me to chase half of England's coastline while you vanish into thin air." He gave a wan smile. "You shouldn't have followed me. You should have known I would." For a moment, the old rhythm of their partnership hovered between them, the quick wit, the shared defiance. Then it faded, leaving only the wind and the low rumble of the sea beneath their feet. Tommy gestured toward a bench sheltered by the pier's railings. "We can't talk here." "Then where?" "Nowhere safe," he said quietly. "But I'll try." They sat. The boards beneath them creaked, damp with spray. Tuppence took in his face, drawn, unshaven, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. This was not the steady, teasing husband she knew. This was a man bearing the weight of something long and terrible. "I've seen ghosts before," she said softly, "but never one wearing my husband's overcoat. Out with it, Tommy. What are you mixed up in?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You remember Lisbon?" "Hardly an easy thing to forget." "Then you'll remember Clara Durand." Tuppence nodded slowly. "Or should I say, Clara Dean?" "Yes, I've heard. I met her, after her death, as it were." His head snapped up. "You what?" "I found her trail, her name, her handbag by the cliffs. The police think she fell." He looked away. "She didn't fall." "Then tell me what happened." Tommy's hands clenched. "I can't. One wrong move could undo years of silence. People died to keep that file buried, Tuppence. Good people. If I speak now—" She interrupted, voice rising with a mix of fear and anger. "Don't give me riddles, Tommy. What have you done? What are you hiding from me?" He turned to her, eyes dark and desperate. "From you? Never from you. I've been trying to protect you, from what was left of that old case, from the lies we built our peace upon." Her breath caught. "Lies?" He exhaled, defeated. "Back in 45 there was a leak. A British courier sold names to the Germans. 2 agents were betrayed and shot. We thought it was Clara Durand. The codebook vanished the same night. I was ordered to cover it up, to bury it. But I found proof later that she wasn't guilty. Someone else was. Someone high enough that the truth had to die with her." "And you?" "I was the one who sent her into the field. She trusted me, and she never came back." Tuppence's anger faltered, replaced by quiet pity. "You've carried that all these years." He gave a small, humourless laugh. "Carried? It's carried me. Every letter I've written, every silence, it's all been to keep that from reaching you. When Clara reappeared, I thought I could set it right. But Fenwick—" "Fenwick?" Tommy hesitated, glancing toward the far end of the pier where a few early evening strollers drifted by. "He was part of the old network too. Used to go by another name, Fenton. He's been using what's left of the cipher to blackmail anyone connected with it. He found out Clara was alive, tried to use her to get to me. That's why I came back here, to pay him off or stop him." "And Clara?" "I thought she was dead," he said quietly. "I found her by the cliffs, unresponsive, and the sea did the rest, or so I believed. I thought I could hide what had happened, but the sea takes less kindly to secrets than men do." Tuppence sat still for a long moment. "And the shell casing?" she asked finally. His gaze flicked to her handbag, startled. "You found it?" "In my room last night, engraved with a T. What does it mean?" He shook his head. "A warning. It's not mine. Whoever killed Clara, and Atherton, I'd wager, wants me next." "And you still think I should stop digging?" "Yes." The word burst out of him, sharp with panic. "Tuppence, please. If they know you're involved—" "Too late for that," she said, rising. "I've already had my room turned over, been followed and nearly frightened out of my wits. If you wanted to keep me safe, you should have trusted me. But you don't get to decide what I know, Tommy Beresford." He reached for her arm, but she pulled back. For a moment their eyes met, hers fierce, his full of old guilt and fear. "I've spent my life at your side," she said quietly. "Don't you dare shut me out now." He closed his eyes. "I can't lose you, Tuppence." "Then you'd better start telling me the truth." They might have said more, but a sudden crack split the air, sharp, unmistakable. A gunshot. The sound echoed across the water, followed by a single, startled cry. Tommy sprang up, scanning the pier. A small crowd had gathered near the lamppost at the far end. Tuppence felt the old, cold rush of adrenaline she remembered from their younger days. Together they ran toward the noise. A man lay sprawled beside the rail, a pistol near his hand. The wind whipped at his coat, revealing a familiar face turned to the side. Mr. Fenwick. Tuppence knelt beside him. His spectacles were gone, his eyes half open, staring blankly toward the sea. Tommy crouched beside her. "He's gone," he said grimly. A constable came running up from the promenade below, shouting for people to stand back. The pier had already begun to buzz with rumour. Suicide, they said. Always the quiet ones. Inspector Renshaw arrived minutes later, his hat tilted against the wind. "Well," he said after a brief glance, "looks like our Mr. Fenwick decided he'd had enough. Shot himself clean through the temple." "Did he?" Tuppence asked. Renshaw frowned. "You've got a different theory, Mrs. Beresford." She nodded toward the pistol. "He's left-handed, Inspector." The policeman blinked. "And how would you know that?" "Because he stirred his coffee with his left hand every morning," she said evenly. "And that gun's lying by his right." Renshaw looked sceptical but knelt to examine the weapon. "We'll see what the coroner says. For now, I'll call it suicide. And you two," he looked between them, "ought to stay put. No more games of cloak and dagger. I'm beginning to think Torquay's turned into a blasted spy novel." Tuppence's expression didn't change. "Perhaps it always was, Inspector. Only some of us are just now turning the page." They walked back from the pier together, the wind biting, the taste of salt and smoke on their lips. The lamps flickered as they passed, their footsteps loud in the hush that follows death. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally Tuppence said softly, "He was frightened, Tommy. I saw it in him yesterday. He knew something was coming." Tommy nodded. "He said he wanted out, that he'd made a bargain too many times. Maybe someone decided he was worth more dead than alive." "And now we're next." He glanced sideways at her. "I am, perhaps. You're going home." She stopped short. "If you say that again, I'll throw you into the sea myself." Despite everything, he smiled, a small, weary curve of the mouth. "You haven't changed." "Nor have you," she said, looping her arm through his. "Except you've picked up a habit of keeping secrets, and I mean to cure you of it." They reached the end of the promenade, where the sea stretched into darkness and the wind howled like a restless soul. Tuppence looked back once at the pier. The constables were already covering the body, the crowd dispersing like mist. "Suicide," she murmured. "It's always so convenient, isn't it?" Tommy didn't answer. His gaze was distant, troubled. He was no saint, Tuppence, but he didn't deserve that. "Few people do." She tightened her arm around his. "Come on, let's go where it's warm. You can start explaining everything over a pot of tea, and this time you won't leave out a single word." He sighed, but there was no resistance in him now. "All right," he said softly. "No more lies." As they turned toward the hotel, the tide surged against the rocks with the steady, relentless rhythm of fate. Above them, The pier lamps flickered and went out one by one, until only the sea remained, black, endless, and waiting. Rain had returned to Torquay like an uninvited guest, soft at first, then insistent, drumming against the windows of the Kingfisher Hotel as the evening tide rose with slow determination. In room 11, where Mr. Fenwick had spent his last uneasy nights, Tuppence Beresford stood alone among the ghosts he'd left behind. The police had sealed the door, but a quiet word and an even quieter smile had persuaded Inspector Renshaw that a widow's curiosity was hardly criminal. He'd warned her to tread carefully. She'd promised she would. She lied beautifully. The room was stale with tobacco and loneliness. His suitcase stood half open, its contents dishevelled from the hurried search that followed his death. A few shirts, a shaving kit, a pair of reading glasses in a cracked case, and beneath the tray, a travel guide. The South Devon Coast, 1946 edition. Tuppence sat at the small writing desk, turning the book over in her hands. It was heavy, its spine thickened by damp. When she fanned the pages, something fluttered loose, a slip of thin paper, folded thrice and covered in penciled symbols, small triangles, dots and dashes arranged like musical notes. She unfolded another, hidden farther inside the binding, and found lines of similar markings. Between them, in neat copperplate, a phrase repeated, "Lisbon knew more than London ever dared to print." Her heart quickened. The phrase Fenwick had used on the promenade, the same that had made Tommy flinch. This was no travel guide, it was a cipher book. She fetched a pencil from the desk and studied the pattern. She wasn't a cryptographer, but she had learned enough in wartime to recognize repetition. Letters replaced by shapes, names disguised in code. And there, on one page, in plain English among the marks, Kingfisher Point, 8 miles west, Archive House, a location, a trail, and perhaps the truth. By mid-afternoon, the rain had thinned to mist. Tuppence drove herself along the coast road, the old Morris engine complaining on every incline. The sea stretched to her right, pale and unkind, and the cliffs reared up in broken teeth. She found the mansion just as the code had promised, a derelict house crouched above the sea, half swallowed by ivy and mist. Its gates hung crooked, the rusted sign still faintly legible, Archive House, property of the Admiralty. Once it had been a naval listening post, gathering whispers from the Atlantic War. Now it was a ruin, forgotten by everyone except those who couldn't afford to forget. The door yielded after one firm shove, its hinges screaming like a thing long denied speech. Inside, the air was thick with salt and neglect. She stepped through a hallway lined with broken portraits, officers, all of them, eyes proud and empty. Her torchlight found a brass plaque beside one of the doors. Operations Archive, restricted. Restricted, she murmured, smiling. How very encouraging. The handle turned stiffly. The door opened into a long, low room where filing cabinets stood like gravestones. Dust motes swirled in the torch beam. A row of rusted map drawers gaped open, their contents curling with age. Tuppence moved slowly, scanning labels. 1941, U-boat reports, Lisbon network, double-agent correspondence. She pulled one file at random, and there, beneath layers of yellowed paper, she saw the unmistakable handwriting of her husband. Thomas Beresford, Field Liaison, Lisbon Command. Her breath caught. The report was brief, a summary of courier movements in late 1943, but attached to it was a photograph, grainy and smudged. 2 figures shaking hands in front of a military jeep. Tommy and Clara Durand. Tuppence sat heavily on the nearest chair, the damp leather groaning beneath her. She stared at the photo as though willing it to change. His expression was not one of guilt or affection, but something more complicated. Recognition, perhaps, tinged with sorrow. Had he protected her, or betrayed her? Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. A loose pane clattered somewhere overhead. She slipped the photograph into her handbag and turned back to the desk. Another folder lay open, the title typed in fading ink. Cipher Continuation, 1945. Inside was a page torn from the same travel guide she had found in Fenwick's room. At the bottom, written in a darker, firmer hand, were 4 words. Beresford, last witness alive. She felt the chill run up her spine. It was not a statement, it was a warning. A sudden sound shattered the silence, the sharp metallic scrape of a bolt sliding home. Tuppence spun around. The main door had closed behind her. Footsteps echoed briefly, then silence. Someone had locked her in. Her first instinct was calm, controlled. Panic came later, but not yet. She crossed to the door and tried the handle. It was firm, unyielding. She called out, "Hello?" But her voice came back hollow. The sea crashed against the cliffs below, louder now, the tide rising. The air in the room felt heavier. She moved to the window. The frame was swollen with damp, the glass cracked but intact. The latch, however, was rusted shut. She pried at it with the edge of a ruler until it gave, sending flakes of paint into the wind. Outside lay a narrow ledge slick with rain and sea spray. Far below, the waves struck the rocks like hammer blows. "Well, Tuppence," she whispered, "it wouldn't be the first time you've had to climb for your life." She slipped off her heels and hauled herself through the gap, gripping the frame for balance. The wind tore at her hat and whipped her hair loose. Inch by inch, she edged along the wall toward the next window. Behind her, the locked room remained silent except for the sound of papers stirring in the draught, whispering as if the past itself were trying to speak. At the second window, she braced herself and pushed. The frame gave with a groan, and she tumbled inside onto a dusty carpet. For a moment she lay still, catching her breath. Then she rose, brushing dirt from her coat. The adjoining corridor led back toward the front of the house. At the door she paused, listening. No footsteps now. Whoever had trapped her had gone, or was waiting elsewhere. She hurried down the drive, the handbag clutched tight, the photograph and cipher page safe inside. The rain had turned again to mist, curling around her like smoke. By the time she reached the car, her coat was soaked through. She started the engine and glanced once more at the mansion, its windows like blind eyes staring out to sea. Beresford, last witness alive. She said the words aloud, testing them, tasting them. If Tommy was the last witness, then someone wanted him silenced, and her along with him. Back at the Kingfisher, she slipped quietly through the side entrance, avoiding the lounge where Renshaw and his constables still lingered over Fenwick's death. She climbed the stairs to her room and locked the door behind her. The mirror showed a woman transformed, hair damp, face pale, eyes bright with resolve. She emptied her handbag onto the bed, the photograph, the coded page, a few damp shillings, and the shell casing engraved with the letter T. Lining them up carefully, she studied them like pieces on a chessboard. The cipher key, the photograph, the casing, all threads leading to one name. Beresford. Her husband was not just involved, he was the centre of it, the last man alive who knew what truly happened in Lisbon. Tuppence folded the cipher page and slipped it into her diary. Then, with a steady hand, she wrote a single line beneath the date. "If anything happens to me, tell Tommy the truth is not buried. It's waiting by the sea." The wind rattled the panes and the sound of the surf below grew stronger, nearer. Somewhere in the hotel, a door shut softly. Tuppence extinguished the lamp, sat in the darkness and listened. The tide was coming in fast, and with it she knew would come the next move of the unseen hand that had locked her in the past. The storm had not waited for dawn. It struck just after midnight, rolling in from the channel like an army advancing under cover of thunder. The wind came first, howling through the cliffs, rattling the shutters of the old mansion. Then the rain, hard and relentless, slashing against the stone like a siege. Tuppence Beresford stood on the narrow drive, her coat pulled tight, staring at the single light that burned in the upper window of Archive House. She knew who had lit it. She'd known from the moment she found his note slipped beneath her door at the Kingfisher. One last errand. Stay away. Stay away, indeed. She trudged up the path, shoes sinking into the wet gravel. The sea crashed below, angry and insistent, as if urging her to turn back. But Tuppence never had been good at obedience. Inside, the air was heavy with damp and decay. Her torch cut a pale beam through the darkness, catching on the glint of water that pooled along the floorboards. The tide had risen higher than before. It was coming in under the walls now, seeping through the cracks like some ancient truth that refused to stay buried. "Tommy," she called softly. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind and distant thunder. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a faint reply. "Tuppence?" The voice was hoarse, tired, and terribly familiar. She followed it to the operations room, the same room where she had found the cipher the day before. The light she'd seen from outside came from a hurricane lamp on the desk. Beside it stood Tommy, sleeves rolled, hair damp from the storm, papers strewn before him. He looked up when she entered, and something passed across his face, a mix of relief, guilt, and resignation. "I told you not to come." "I've been ignoring that sort of instruction since 1918, she said briskly, closing the door behind her. "Now what are you doing?" He gestured to the heap of folders. "Finishing it. These files, they're the last copies. Fenwick kept the others for insurance. I'm going to burn what's left. End it before someone else dies over it." "Burning evidence again, Tommy? That's unlike you." "It's unlike me to lose control too," he said quietly, "but I've lost enough already." She crossed to the desk, her eyes scanning the scattered documents, photographs, transcripts, coded lists, and one file marked simply, "Durand, Clara, classified." "So it's true," she said softly. "You were trying to clear her name." He met her gaze squarely. She wasn't the traitor, Tuppence. She was the scapegoat. They blamed her because she was convenient, foreign-born, independent, too clever for her own good. It was easier than admitting one of their own was selling secrets. "And you knew who it was?" "Yes." He hesitated. "Fenwick, or rather, Fenton. He was MI9 once before he went freelance. When the war ended, he used the cipher network to blackmail those involved. Atherton paid him off for years. When Clara reappeared, he saw another chance to cash in. I thought I could bargain with him, to buy her peace." Tuppence studied him for a long moment. "You should have told me." "I wanted to keep you safe." "Don't insult me, Tommy. I married you for better or for espionage." A flicker of a smile touched his lips, brief but genuine. Then he reached for the lamp. "Help me destroy them before anyone else." A voice interrupted, calm and almost amused. "Too late for that, I'm afraid." They both turned. In the doorway stood Inspector Renshaw. His raincoat gleamed wet, his hat pulled low, his revolver steady in his hand. "Inspector," Tuppence said sharply, "you've a talent for arriving at the wrong moment." "Oh, I don't know," he said, stepping inside. "I'd say my timing's rather perfect. I've been waiting a long time for this little archive to resurface." Tommy straightened. "So, it's you." Renshaw smiled faintly. "You really should have guessed. Who else knew every move you made, every file you touched? I investigated you, Beresford, 20 years ago. I made sure the trail stopped where it was meant to." "The Lisbon leak," Tommy said quietly. "It wasn't Clara, it was you." Renshaw shrugged. A man must look after himself. After the war, they forgot their heroes. But secrets, they're better currency than medals. He advanced a step. "Now hand me the cipher. You've done enough damage playing at Patriot." Tuppence's eyes flicked toward the desk, where the torn page lay exposed, the one that bore Tommy's name. She spoke evenly. "And if we refuse?" Renshaw smiled again, without warmth. "Then the sea takes care of the problem for me. The foundation's cracked. The next high tide will finish the job. I'd rather not wait." He raised the gun. The wind slammed against the windows. The lamp flickered. In that instant of darkness, Tuppence moved. She hurled the heavy cipher book toward him. It struck his arm. The shot went wild, splintering wood above the desk. Tommy lunged forward, grappling with him. The room erupted in noise, boots scraping, furniture crashing, the groan of the building as another wave struck the outer wall. Tuppence seized the lamp and swung it hard. Glass shattered, flame flared. Renshaw staggered back, cursing. The gun clattered to the floor. Tommy kicked it aside and pinned him against the desk. "You killed Atherton," he hissed. "You tried to kill Clara. You made her disappear. And Fenwick, he knew it, didn't he?" Renshaw spat a laugh. "They were weak. They believed in causes. I believed in survival." Another crash of thunder. Another shudder through the floor. The sea was in the house now, water gushing up through the cracks, swirling around their feet. "Tommy!" Tuppence shouted. "The tide!" He released Renshaw just long enough to snatch the cipher pages. "Go, Tuppence! I'm not leaving without you!" But Renshaw lunged again, striking out with desperate strength. The two men struggled, half submerged, as the floorboards began to buckle. The gun, forgotten for a moment, drifted in the rising water. Tuppence saw it first. She dove for it, cold water closing around her arms. When she surfaced, Renshaw had Tommy by the throat. "Let him go." The revolver wavered in her hand. For a second no one moved, then a single wave slammed through the window, the sea exploding into the room. A shot rang out. Renshaw froze, eyes wide, then fell backward into the surge. Tommy caught her wrist, pulling her toward the stairs. The water was waist-deep now, dragging at their legs, carrying papers and furniture past them in a torrent. "Come on!" They stumbled upward, the roar of the sea filling the house. Behind them the door burst from its hinges, and Archive House began to die, one wall collapsing into the surf below. On the landing they paused, breathless. Tuppence clutched the soaked cipher pages against her chest. Tommy wrapped an arm around her, steadying them both. The last thing they heard before the roof gave way was the echo of waves devouring the room below, sweeping the past and Renshaw's body into the black water. By dawn the storm had spent itself. The sea lay bruised and exhausted beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. Waves still licked at the base of the cliffs where Archive House had once stood, but the house itself was gone, torn open by the tide, swallowed piece by piece until only a jagged corner of stone remained, jutting out like a broken tooth against the surf. On the narrow lane above, Tommy and Tuppence sat wrapped in a single blanket, steam rising faintly from their drenched clothes as the first weak light touched their faces. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with all they had seen, all they had nearly lost. Finally, Tuppence stirred. "He's gone," she said quietly. Tommy nodded. "Renshaw won't trouble anyone again." The wind caught her hair, tossing it into her eyes. "You always did prefer your villains tidy," she said with a faint smile, but there was no humour behind it. Her gaze drifted to the sea, then back to him. "You were going to destroy everything, even the truth." He met her eyes, weary and unguarded. "Some truths do more harm than lies, Tuppence." "I don't believe that. Not from you." Tommy drew a slow breath and reached into his coat pocket. The cipher page, water-stained, torn but legible, was still there. He handed it to her. "You'd better read it, the last piece." She unfolded it carefully. The paper was soft from the sea, the ink blotted and smudged. But between the lines of code in Clara Duran's delicate hand, a letter emerged, hidden in the margins, written in invisible ink and revealed now by damp and salt. Tuppence read aloud, her voice low, unsteady. "If you are reading this, the war has ended, and I am gone. They will call me a traitor, but I did what I must to save the child. She is innocent. Protect her as you once promised to protect me. Tell her nothing until it is safe. Tell her her mother was loyal to England. Tell her she was loved." Beneath that, in smaller script, a single signature, Clara Duran. Tuppence looked up, eyes wide. "The child, Clara Fenwick?" Tommy nodded slowly. "Yes, born in Lisbon. Her father was an English officer, Major Atherton. He and Clara fell in love during the mission. When the affair was discovered, Renshaw used it to blackmail them both. After the war, Atherton took his own life rather than expose her. I thought the girl had died too, but Renshaw found her years later, made her his puppet. That's how he kept Fenwick under his thumb." Tuppence's brow furrowed. "And you—" "I promised Clara I'd protect her daughter," he said quietly. "When she came to me that last night before the operation, she begged me to get the child out of Portugal. I did. Smuggled her to England under another name. Clara Fenwick was raised as the ward of an old family friend. She never knew." Tuppence closed the letter gently. "So all this, the ciphers, the blackmail, the secrets, it was never about you or the file. It was about a mother trying to save her child." He gave a small nod. "And a fool trying to keep his promise." The wind stirred again, carrying the smell of salt and rain. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Tuppence said softly, "Why didn't you tell me, Tommy, all these years?" His answer was barely audible. "Because I thought it would end what we built. I thought if you knew I'd once loved another woman's courage more than my own, it would change everything." She regarded him steadily. "You don't give me much credit, do you?" He looked away, shame and affection warring in his expression. You were the only peace I ever had. I couldn't risk it. Tuppence smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. You forget, Tommy. We've never solved a case apart. You keep your secrets, I ferret them out, and somehow we muddle through. That's us. He gave a small, disbelieving laugh. You sound remarkably forgiving for a woman who's nearly drowned, been shot at, and accused of espionage. Forgiving? She tilted her head. No, I simply prefer the truth. It's far easier to live with than doubt. He reached for her hand, cold and trembling. Then perhaps it's time I stop hiding from you. You already have, she said softly. The sun was pushing through now, weak but persistent, turning the sea from grey to pale gold. Below them the tide began to recede, dragging with it the last fragments of the house and the past it had held. Tuppence stood and brushed off the blanket. Come on, we'd better find somewhere with a decent breakfast and a working telephone. I imagine the Admiralty will want a word or two. Tommy smiled, rising beside her. And Scotland Yard. Yes, she said thoughtfully, though I think Renshaw's final confession will keep them occupied. Imagine, a traitor hiding behind a policeman's badge all these years. He grimaced. It's almost poetic. Almost, she agreed, but not quite. They began the slow walk back toward the road, their footsteps crunching on gravel. Behind them, the cliffs gleamed wet and empty, the sea whispering over what was left of Archive House. Tuppence slipped her arm through his. You know, she said lightly, you might have mentioned at some point that we were housing an international scandal under our own roof. He chuckled softly. You'd have only insisted on taking the poor girl in and interrogating her over tea. Quite right, she said briskly, and we'd have solved the whole thing in half the time. He stopped and turned to her, eyes crinkling at the corners despite the exhaustion etched there. You truly never change, do you? Of course I do, she said, lifting her chin, but I try not to let you notice. They stood for a moment, the wind tugging gently at their coats. The morning light caught her hair, turning it to threads of copper. He thought she had never looked braver, or dearer. Tuppence, he said softly, you saved me. She squeezed his arm. Rubbish. You'd have done the same for me, eventually. They started walking again, side by side, their silhouettes small against the wide, clearing sky. And as the gulls wheeled above and the waves whispered along the shore, the secret that had haunted them for 20 years slipped quietly beneath the surface, finally, mercifully, at rest. London never apologizes for its weather. A week after the storm that had drowned the Devon coast, the city seemed determined to prove its indifference. Low grey sky, a hint of drizzle, the smell of coal smoke and damp stone. But inside the small red brick house in South Audley Street, the air was bright with domestic calm. The clock on the mantel struck 4, a log fire crackled in the grate, and Tuppence Beresford, her legs neatly tucked beneath her, was arranging tea things on a low table with the unhurried grace of one who has restored order to chaos. Tommy sat nearby in his armchair, the Times folded across his knee. The headline, already stale, read, Coastal Mansion Collapses in Storm. Police Investigate. He had read it 3 times and understood every word, yet the story beneath those polite phrases would never be printed. Tuppence glanced up. Still brooding over the paper? Merely admiring the efficiency with which officialdom rewrites history, he replied dryly. According to this, Archive House fell into the sea quite of its own accord. No mention of traitors, gunfire, or a particularly stubborn wife. Then they've written a perfectly accurate account, she said sweetly, handing him his cup. The stubborn wife is drinking tea, not giving statements. All's well that ends, messily. He smiled despite himself. You're impossible, you know. So, you keep telling me. She settled opposite him and stirred her cup. They've given Renshaw a splendid funeral, you'll be amused to hear. A closed coffin, naturally. The press called him a hero. Tommy's jaw tightened. A hero? Yes. They always prefer their villains dead, easier to decorate. Tuppence's voice softened. Let it rest, darling. The truth's been told, where it needed to be, and Clara's name is clear at last. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of fatigue and gratitude. Because of you. Because of us, she corrected. You did the dangerous part, remember. I only insisted on living through it. A brief silence fell, The rain ticked against the window panes, gentle and persistent. It was the kind of London rain that never quite stopped, merely waited for you to notice. Tommy folded the newspaper and set it aside. Strange, isn't it? A week ago we were standing knee-deep in seawater, and now we're back to sugar tongs and correspondence. Feels almost indecently normal. That's marriage for you, said Tuppence. 1 minute you're saving England, the next you're arguing about whether the milk's gone off. He chuckled, then leaned forward, elbows on knees. Tuppence, did you ever regret it? Any of it? She considered. The firelight played over her face, softening its usual quick intelligence into something gentler. Regret, she said at last. No. It's all rather us, isn't it? The adventure, the danger, the occasional near drowning. I only wish you'd let me pack a proper raincoat. He laughed aloud, and the sound seemed to push back the greyness of the afternoon. The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. Albert, faithful as ever, appeared a moment later bearing the post on a small silver tray. Only one, madam, he said. Rather odd-looking envelope. Came by special delivery. Tuppence took it, frowning slightly. The paper was heavy cream, the handwriting elegant and unfamiliar. Across the flap, a seal of blue wax gleamed faintly in the firelight. For you, Mrs. Beresford, Albert added, then withdrew with the solemnity of a stage butler exiting after the crucial clue. Tommy raised an eyebrow. A secret admirer, perhaps? If it is, said Tuppence, he has excellent stationery. She turned the envelope over, broke the seal, and drew out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting inside was neat, feminine, unmistakably foreign in its grace. Tuppence read silently for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she passed the letter across. Tommy read aloud, Thank you for finding the truth he could never tell. The sea keeps its silence now, and so shall I. C.D. He looked up slowly. Clara Durand. Or Clara Fenwick, said Tuppence. Whichever name she's decided belongs to her today. Tommy stared at the page, the blue wax seal still intact on the corner. So, she survived, Tuppence nodded. Renshaw must have taken her from the cliffs that night, hidden her away to keep her quiet. Perhaps she escaped after his death, or perhaps she simply wanted us to know she was alive. She doesn't owe us thanks, he said softly. No, Tuppence agreed, but she offered it anyway. That's something. Tommy folded the letter and handed it back. What will you do with it? She slipped it into the desk drawer beside the others, their case files, mementos, confessions. Add it to the collection, of course. Every marriage needs its curiosities. He grinned. A peculiar sort of honeymoon album. Oh, hush. At least ours doesn't include any dreadful seasides or sentimental sunsets. He rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the fog was thickening again, softening the outlines of the street lamps. Do you know, he said, I keep thinking about the Kingfisher Hotel. Poor old Haskins telephoned this morning. The place burned to the ground last night. Tuppence looked up sharply. Burned? Electrical fault, they say. Though between ourselves, I'd wager someone wanted the last of those files gone for good. She poured another cup of tea. Let them burn. Some stories deserve no audience. Tommy turned from the window, watching her with quiet affection. You've changed, you know. She smiled. I should hope so. It's dreadfully dull staying the same. I mean it, he said. You were always brave, but this... He broke off, searching for words. You were extraordinary. Tuppence waved the compliment away. Nonsense, I was terrified most of the time. But then, so were you. He laughed. Quite. The mantel clock chimed again. 5 soft strokes that echoed through the room. The fire had burned low, the coals glowing like the embers of some half-forgotten secret. Tuppence leaned back in her chair. You know, Tommy, she said lazily, life's rather disappointing after espionage. I might take up gardening. He gave her a look of mock alarm. You and a trowel are a more dangerous combination than any revolver. Then perhaps I'll take up writing my memoirs instead. That's worse, she laughed, the sound warm and light. Oh, don't fret. I'll change all the names, even yours. He crossed back to her and perched on the arm of her chair, watching the fire. Promise me something. Within reason. No more secrets. Between us, I mean. She reached up, took his hand and squeezed it gently. Agreed, though I reserve the right to be mysterious when absolutely necessary. He bent and kissed her forehead. Naturally. For a while they sat together in companionable silence. Outside the fog deepened, wrapping the city in its muffled calm. Somewhere a cab rattled over cobblestones. Somewhere else a church bell tolled the half-hour. Tuppence poured what was left of the tea into her cup, stirred it thoughtfully, and said at last, "Well, Tommy, what shall we hide next?" He glanced at her, startled, then saw the twinkle in her eyes and smiled. "Heaven preserve us," he murmured. "You're already bored." "Of course," she said serenely. "Peace never lasts long in this household. But until the next adventure, more sugar?" He held out his cup obediently, the 2 spoons of sugar clinking softly against the china. The fire flared once more, painting their faces in gold and shadow. Beyond the curtained windows, London continued in its grey, indifferent rhythm. But inside, amid the scent of tea and the echo of laughter, the Beresfords sat close, partners still, bound not by secrets anymore, but by the quiet, dangerous comfort of knowing that somewhere, inevitably, another mystery waited.